The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisperer in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am pleased to bring you another installment of A Chance Encounter, a conversation with members of the Arkham Horror LCG community who have contributed to the game, whether that's building decks, writing strategy articles, hosting podcasts, or recording playthroughs. Today's guest really needs no introduction. Designer Matt Newman co-created the Arkham Horror LCG as well as the 5 campaigns and various standalone scenarios that have taken us from Arkham to Dunwich to the streets of Paris, the jungles of Central America, and the outer reaches of interstellar space. I was thrilled to have a chance to sit down with Matt at Arkham Nights 2019 to discuss the Arkham Horror LCG as it enters its 4th year. Before we get to the interview, I'd like to thank the patrons of this channel for their tremendous support. The Arkham Horror LCG community is amazing, and these people have gone above and beyond to bring you content like these interviews. If you'd like to become a patron to support the channel's goals and see your name in lights, follow the link down below, sign up for a tier, and claim your rewards. That would be awesome. Without further ado, let's talk to Matt Newman. Hello, Arkham Horror fans. Man from Leng here. I am thrilled to be joined by Arkham Horror LCG designer Matt Newman on today's show. Thanks very much, Matt, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So you have today is Arkham Nights, the first day, and they'll be playing the Blob scenario tonight. Can you tell me a little bit about that for people who haven't?
Yeah, so if you haven't heard or if you haven't seen the announcement on our webpage, the Blob That Ate Everything is a special epic multiplayer scenario where any number of groups of up to 4 investigators each have to team up to fight a singular entity with a health pool in the hundreds, if not thousands. It's a really fun scenario, and it's cool because it can pretty much take any number of players, like from 1 to 96. We did a Gen Con, a 96-person game, and it was a lot of fun. Yeah.
So how many do you expect for tonight's game?
I don't know. I don't know how many groups they have room for, let alone have signed up. So it could be 12, it could be 24, it could be 48. I actually don't know. Yeah. But we're going to be running more than one. We're going to do one tonight, and then I think 2 or 3 groups tomorrow. I think 2 groups tomorrow. Yeah.
All right. So you mentioned a little bit about how did this one come about? Because you've done a few of these larger games, like with Labyrinths of Lunacy and the Guardians of the Abyss. Last year, you had people contributing to the overall
to the result. Yeah. So for this one, it was kind of, we wanted to do the epic multiplayer mode again in the vein of Labyrinths, but we wanted to do it differently. And we also kind of, we learned some lessons from Labyrinths, and we wanted to kind of explore a different avenue of like, how else can we do epic multiplayer? And Brad Andrews, who's the lead developer for Keyforge, he came up with this idea for like a giant blob that can eat whatever you throw at it. And then from there, we just kind of, developed that idea further. Yeah.
Cool. So the Circle Undone cycle just wrapped up, but how do you feel about the cycle now that you've had a chance to see it through the player's eyes?
Mm-hmm. I'm really happy with how it turned out. I think I'm really excited for how the story turned out. I really like all of the characters in that Circle Undone, and all of the investigators for sure. Like some of my favorites. I think everyone, just overall feel really good about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what were some of the highlights for you from a designer's perspective?
I think a couple things. One, the whole like themes of the cycle feel really well integrated into all of the encounter sets and all of the scenarios. There's sort of this overarching mood of inevitability and accepting your fate and demise and stuff like that. And it's not just in like the story. It's flavored into all of the encounter sets. There's like cards that enter play and they don't do anything when you first draw them, but they kind of create this growing sense of dread, this like slow build up, which I think is really cool that we found a way to like explore that in game mechanics as well as in the story. And I also just really like the 2 factions and how they feel, they feel real more so than I think most antagonists in like a game would. Yeah.
Hmm. So how did you come up with the narrative for this? You decided to revisit Arkham after a couple of trips globetrotting, first in Path to Carcosa and then again in Forgotten Age.
Hmm. Yeah, so that I think that was a big part of it initially was we had a couple. We actually haven't had a full 8 scenario cycle yet up until the Circle Undone that was entirely set within Arkham. I mean, in Dunwich, obviously we go to Dunwich. In Carcosa, we go to France for a while, and in Forgotten Age, we're kind of all over the place. So we really wanted to explore like what would a cycle set entirely within Arkham look like? What would it feel like? So that's kind of where it started. And then from there, we went on to explore like what ancient ones do we want to investigate. And as soon as we landed on Azathoth, Azathoth is an ancient one that doesn't have like motives or goals. It just kind of is. It's like a force of nature. So it was important to create antagonists who could really drive the plot forward and drive the story and be sort of the opposition to the investigators or assistance to the investigators depending on the situation. Yeah.
And the cycle really features a lot of the iconic locations and factions of Arkham. Like the witches have a long history, as well as the Silver Twilight Lodge.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to know, especially if you know anything about the Arkham universe, who's going to be trustworthy and who's not.
If any.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Arkham is really a town with a very storied and bloody past. So we wanted to explore that as being like a pretty big theme of like gothic horror, like dealing with the past coming back to haunt you. So it only felt natural to include these organizations that have sort of been around since the beginning, since the inception of Arkham as a place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you're getting to explore it a little more now in the Dream Eaters as well.
Sure.
With the trip to St. Mary's Hospital and then the Unnameable later down the road in the cycle.
Yeah, and there's so many places within Arkham that we can explore. So kind of spreading it out throughout these cycles makes a lot of sense. I mean, we couldn't possibly explore all of them in one cycle, but it was cool to have a cycle that was entirely set within Arkham. We can go to all these different places. Hangman's Hill is another place that's really cool. The Witch House.
So the Path to Carcosa was characterized by a very psychological horror and trying to get in your head, and the Forgotten Age was more of the investigators taking on nature itself, and sort of the horror is within that nature and has evolved from it. What kind of horror were you looking for from the Circle Undone?
So like I said before, it kind of starts off with this gothic horror. Sort of a ghost story with the past coming back to haunt you and curses and stuff like that. But then as the cycle progresses, it starts to turn into more like an existential horror, dealing with themes of like, why are we even here? What's the point? That sort of thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So do you have a favorite treachery or enemy from the cycle?
I think I would probably, it's definitely close. There's a lot that I really like, but I think I like the Piper of Azathoth and the paired demonic pipings, because again, it creates that like slow building tension or pressure where you draw the first demonic piping and it does nothing. You draw the second demonic piping and all of a sudden you start getting worried, and then it's not until you draw the third one that the Piper comes out, and it's just, he's like a really, really tough enemy that we wouldn't normally be able to include in just an encounter set by itself, but because of the demonic piping like building up slowly, it allows us to create like a really powerful enemy that you don't maybe see every time you play. You can go through the entire cycle without seeing it once, but it still creates that pressure, even just knowing that it exists, just setting it aside and being like, oh, I hope he never comes out.
There's similar cards like Terror. Terror
in the Night, and Fate of All Fools is kind of in that same set where it's like the first one does nothing, and it's every subsequent one starts doing bad stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you really load up the threat area this time. Was that something that you were trying to explore?
Yeah, it was, because again, like this idea of like being cursed or being haunted kind of feels like there should be stacking effects on your investigator, like this weight is pressing down on you, and it just gets worse and worse and worse over time.
So the cycle featured some of the more difficult scenarios, I think, at least for a solo player like myself. There's like the secret name, which which seems, excuse me, a very long scenario. Like it could have almost been two scenarios,
Sure.
like
Yeah.
Heart of the Elders or something like that, and then Wages of Sin, and then Union and Disillusion. Those Brazier tests are pretty tough when you're in solo. What is it like for you as a designer trying to balance that, balance both for solo and multiplayer as well as for new players and older players?
Yeah, it's definitely tough. It's not easy. We have playtest groups that play in solo. We have playtest groups that play 2-player, 3-player, and 4-player. So it's not that we have a particular lean towards any player count, but it's always like each scenario tries to test different things. Like there are some scenarios that really test your combat. There's some scenarios that really test your investigation skills or your movement or what have you. And then there are some scenarios that are designed to really test everything. And those are the scenarios where it's going to be a little tougher in solo because you kind of have to play all of the angles of the game. You've got to be able to deal with enemies. You've got to be able to deal with treacheries. You've got to be able to deal with clues, movement, all that stuff. So there are always going to be a few scenarios where it's just harder in solo. And then the onus is on me to make sure that it's not too much harder or like so much harder that it's frustrating. And that's where our fantastic playtest group comes in, and they'll provide feedback one way or the other usually. But we try to keep them as balanced as possible, but sometimes it's just going to be the case where some scenarios are just harder in solo. And then there's going to be some scenarios that are harder in multiplayer because the cards really synergize and they jive well together.
Yeah. The encounter deck can combo more.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Create those sorts of feedback loops that cause all sorts of trouble.
Yeah.
Is it a concern for you at all when you're, like, for somebody who may have just purchased the core set and there's sort of a jump between, say, you do the Gathering, which is sort of baby steps into Arkham, and then you jump up to Miskatonic or Midnight Masks,
Right.
which forces you to, like, the Gathering, if you play it without Return 2, it's a pretty lazy.
Yeah, it's like a tutorial. Yeah,
You can
up
pretty
until
much
the
walk
Golders.
through it, and then in Midnight you really have to move.
Right.
Are
yeah.
you concerned at all? Like there's another jump up to like a deluxe expansion for players?
Right. There certainly is, at least in complexity, because we're trying to sort of we're trying to please multiple groups. We're trying to make sure that the veteran players have something new to experience, and it's not more of the same. It's something that they haven't seen before, but also simple enough that a new player could buy the core set and then jump immediately into a new cycle. So we kind of have, and that's again where our playtesters come in, because we'll have some playtesters that we specifically recruit to be like new, like, oh, you've only played a core set? Perfect, we're gonna have you join this playtest group. And then some playtesters, of course, are gonna be veteran players. So it's kind of like we're trying to have our cake and eat it too in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you recently unveiled the 5th deluxe expansion, the Dream Eaters, in one of my favorite settings, the Dreamlands. What can players expect when they enter the Dreamlands here in the months to come?
Sure. So the Dreamlands is a really cool setting because H.P. Lovecraft's dream cycle of short stories, which is what most, or novellas for some of them, which is what most of this is taken from, is very different tonally from the rest of his works. It's a lot more fantastical. It's a bit more whimsical. It's not quite as like horrifying, and it's certainly not the same sort of existential dread that he's really known for. So the Dream Eaters cycle takes on that same kind of tone where, at least for the scenarios that are set inside the Dreamlands, it's a bit more of like maybe a fantasy adventure with some pulpy 1920s feel in there. And then of course, the other half of the campaign, the B campaign, is a bit more of the traditional sort of Arkham horror feel. Yeah.
So the Dreamlands is a vast world. I mean, Lovecraft created a lot of it, and then other authors have since added to it over the years. And how difficult was that for you to go into something like that and have to cherry pick the best parts of it?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically impossible to fit all of it. So definitely shouldn't expect all of it to be there because it's so big. So what we tried to do is kind of pick the elements that I think are like the most iconic out of all of it, and then try to include a lot of the rest of it in little bits and cameos here and there. The second scenario in the A campaign, the Search for Kadath, is mostly like a big romp, like throughout, like a globe-trotting romp all throughout the Dreamlands. So tried to fit in as much as we could in there. But really, theoretically, each and every one of those locations could have been like a whole scenario. So there's definitely a lot of ground that we didn't cover, and there's certainly more that we could always come back to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now
And it's really hard to figure out what to use and what not to use.
Yeah, you'd mentioned to me previously too that one of your favorite elements was the cats of Ulthar.
Yeah.
And you were able
Talking
to
cats.
you're able to get the talking cats in the deluxe expansion. You have a cat yourself, I think you were.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
So what is it about the cats that
They're very noble creatures, but also have this like air of mischief about them, and I don't know. Like I could, like Lovecraft, I could probably talk about cats for hours. Though I don't share his opinion about dogs. But yeah, I'm a big fan of cats in general. But they feature quite prominently in this cycle, I think.
You've done a bunch of eight scenario campaigns, as well as a few standalones that you can weave in. But now you've got 4 scenario campaigns that you can weave in. How did you develop that, come up with that idea?
So it kind of came from a couple different things. One was this desire that I saw within the community for a shorter campaign, that people kept going back to the Night of the Zealot because they wanted like a short, like 3 or 4 scenario campaign that they could play, or Guardians of the Abyss is another example, that they could play maybe like in a night or in a weekend. So I thought that would be a cool way to deliver that while also still maintaining that 6-pack 1 deluxe box model that players are used to. And then also I thought it would be cool to have a group of investigators or 2 groups of investigators that are split up, and then they can exchange information between each other but are largely following 2 different paths. So you could maybe play through the A campaign and then play through the B campaign and then get like a fuller picture of what's going on. So that's kind of where the narrative came from.
Mm-hmm. Was that challenging for you to figure out how to weave those elements together as you were designing, or is this old hat by now and you're just like, oh, this is
I wouldn't say old hat. It was different. I wouldn't say it was harder. It was more just it's a faster paced narrative because there's only 4 scenarios to tell the more complete story. So it's kind of just like there's less like, I don't want to say filler, but there's less things that happen on the way to the ending. It's just kind of like boop 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 and then you're there. Yeah.
So how is this? I know that you write short stories in your spare time. How do you think this has helped you as the designing that you do for Arkham helps you as an author, and vice versa?
I think so. Yeah, it's definitely improved my writing skills in general. Although writing for Arkham is like totally different from writing outside of Arkham, because, well, for one thing, the tense and the tone is completely different. The sort of like second person present tense is very difficult to write in, and also just the style of writing. This is meant to be read aloud, right? So it's not the same sort of style of writing that you would write if you were doing just like a narrative, like a first or third person narrative. Yeah.
So you've played around a lot with the card designs lately, and you introduced the bonded cards toward the end of the Circle Undone cycle, and then we found more bonded cards in the Dream Eaters, and expanding the design space there, now incorporating weaknesses and all sorts of great elements there, and then we also got the myriad cards in this cycle as well. Can you tell me a little bit about how those came about and what they were in reaction to?
So I wouldn't say any of them are really a reaction to something. It's more I wanted to explore this idea of like one card bringing in other cards. And I think it started with the lexicon and just this idea of like, well, you have a book and it's got spells in it. So if you read the book, then you learn these spells, right? That's kind of where it started. And that mechanic led to the bonded keyword, which led to the development of all the other bonded cards that were like, well, there's so much that we can do with this. We could have cards that go into the counter deck. We could have weaknesses that go into your deck. There's all kinds of different things that this could be. And I think it wasn't until the segment of Onyx that form a pendant that I was like, oh, this is good. Like, this is cool. There's so many different things that we can do with it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So several months ago, you introduced you unveiled the optional list of taboos for players. What sort of feedback have you received about that?
I think it's been largely positive. I think the cool thing about the list of taboos is that it's optional. I think that's like the most important facet of it, because this is a cooperative game, so players are going to have their own thoughts and their own house rules for how they want to play, and I want to encourage that. I don't want to be like the, we Arkham police and like slap the cards out of your hand and tell you how to play. So the taboo list is really for, it's sort of like a guiding point for us to say, like, this is how we think these cards have shaped up, how we would like to sort of semi-enforce shifts in the meta game, instead of like a restricted list in a normal competitive game where we enforce it. We're more just saying, like, if you want to run with these rules, we think it's cool. If you don't want to, we think that's also cool. That's absolutely your prerogative, your right to play the way that you want to play. So really, it's there as a way of kind of helping and assisting with reshaping the overall sort of community's metagame environment and creating some new dynamic deck building options.
So the first list that was released, I think there were a lot of the cards on there. There weren't that many surprises. A lot of them had come from earlier sets in the game when you may have been still getting, figuring out what worked and what didn't, and where
getting
they should
sea
sit.
legs, as it were.
So what is it when you look, like, what makes a card like that you seriously consider it for the taboo list? What is it about these cards that?
I think it's mostly that they're widely used. Sometimes it doesn't even have to do necessarily with their power level. It could just be that it's like a best in class option or a best in slot option where it's like, it's really hard to come up with an ally that can edge Dr. Mylan out of that spot. And it's not necessarily that he's just like a busted card or anything. It's just that, like, now all of a sudden there's so many different good options for that slot. Having a card that clearly edges out other competitors is maybe bad for the deck building options. So I think that's mostly like the consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, in the most recent fact, you also did something that caught me by surprise. You lowered the experience cost on one card, the Springfield, which has been. I've maligned it myself, but I have, to be honest, I did see Scott play it this weekend. So to good effect.
I still swear by that card. It's good.
So why did it? I know we were talking earlier. This is not something that FFG has typically done in any of their games.
Yeah, it's sort of an unspoken rule of restricted lists is that we don't really usually buff cards. We prefer to sort of bring down the other cards until they're even, or maybe create new cards that can like assist those older cards. So this is sort of a trial run, or sort of like an experiment where we want to see what would happen if we did something like this. And it's a very simple adjustment. It's just like -1 experience. But I think that -1 experience does make a pretty big difference, because now all of a sudden you're comparing it to other cards in the level 3 slot instead of the level 4 slot, and that changes a lot. And so I don't think we should expect to see a lot of that. I think that's something that I want to use very, very sparingly. But I think it's exciting and cool that the option exists for that sort of thing.
And it's nice to have that option with the experience point pips that you can you can tweak those, and you don't necessarily have to go in and change the card text, which is often the problem that people have when it's like, oh, I bought the core set and now Mylan doesn't work the way I thought he did. So
and that's why they're optional, because if we went in and actually errataed the cards, then a new player picks up the core set and they don't even realize that Mylan used to work a different way, which can be really useful for a competitive game when we are enforcing it. But when it's an optional sort of thing, it's a lot easier to just have it, like, the community has one version of the card, and then there's a taboo version that they can optionally choose. So, and the cool thing about the experience pips is once it's in your deck, you don't have to worry about it. Mm-hmm. It works the way the card is written.
So you've been probably living with this game now for probably 5 years since.
Well, it's been out since 2016, so more like 4. Yeah.
More like 4.
Yeah.
So what has that journey been like for you? I think this may have been like this was your baby that you built with Nate.
Yeah.
You've been ferrying it along ever since. What's that journey been like for you?
It's been really fun and exciting. It's a great game to work on because we built the game to handle all sorts of different scenarios and different stories, and I'm able to sort of use my own creativity in coming up with narratives and cards and whatnot. So It honestly feels like it came out yesterday still. Like, it doesn't feel like it's been 3-4 years. It still feels like it's just come out, which is good. It's a good feeling.
And you still have plenty of ideas rolling about it.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Other than I'm excited for Arkham Knights. It's going to be a blast. I had some other surprises that I think you've already seen.
Yes,
and we'll
indeed.
hopefully
What
talk
was
about
what was the name of that?
The Keeper's Nightmare.
The Keeper's Nightmare. Yes, we had an opportunity to play the Keeper's Nightmare last night, and it gave me nightmares. I went to bed last night, and I was having trouble sleeping because of the nightmares that Matt and Jeremy unleashed upon us, and so. Yeah, look forward to that at future game conventions, because it's if you think the encounter deck is bad as it is now, just wait till you have a keeper picking the encounter cards for you. Poor Tony Morgan got crypt chilled when he played Leo, and then he got frozen in feared every time he got rid of a frozen in fear. So. And I know you and Jeremy were both having
we were having a blast.
You guys were having a blast playing this,
Yeah.
and judging by the excitement from the players as well, that was like there was a lot of hooting and hollering.
Yeah, so I'm excited also for the Blob, and of course the Creator Card Council is going on. So yeah, if you haven't made it out to Arkham Knights, and you can come next year, definitely, yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in, and take care.
Thanks again to Matt for taking the time to appear on the show. Our first interview was plagued by technical issues, but Matt was gracious enough to find some time in his busy schedule to re-record, which was awesome. You rock, Matt. Stay tuned for more coverage of Arkham Knights 2019 in the weeks ahead. It was truly an amazing event for Arkham Horror LCG players. That's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.